Hey, what's up guys? It's TechZoomer talking to you here, and today we're going to talk about how the iPad Pro goes against the MacBook Pro M1 and how could it get even better than that by beating it. So in this video I will explain what the iPad Pro needs to bring to the table so it can defeat and win me over when comparing it to the MacBook Pro. Before that, go down there, leave a like and subscribe please. It will help the channel grow, and don't forget to comment down below which one would you choose. So, before we get started... Oh, you're comparing the MacBook against the iPad? Please, everyone will choose the iPad. Apple just needs to bring 3 things to the table, so I believe that in 2021, just talk about the new iPad Pro. Please, do not compare them to the MacBook. You know that the iPad is way better. So, do it. Okay, then I know you prefer the iPad already, but there's some stuff you can do to improve the iPad, so let's talk about them and what Apple needs to do to improve it. Let's get this video started. So, first place, when you compare the two form factors from the iPad Pro and the MacBook Pro, you can see that both of them are pretty similar, but the iPad Pro, it's thinner and lighter. The MacBook weighs over a kilo, where the iPad, it's only 800 grams. You can see that when you compare them both, they're very, very different in terms of thickness, and if you hold them together, you can see that the iPad, it's much lighter. Also, the MacBook features a different design from the iPad, where the MacBook, all the weight is not on the display, but on the base, while the iPad has the weight on the display and not the base. So they sit differently on your table or lap, but you notice more when it's on your lap, because when the iPad, it can fall behind you if you're not paying attention, while the MacBook is sturdy because of the weight. So the center of gravity wins on the MacBook, but the form factor, I prefer the form factor from the iPad. It's much, much better. So when you put them together and you compare them, I would go for the iPad form factor. Secondly, you can see that the iPad features these 3 dots right here. This is the smart connector. The smart connector is one of the most useful things that the iPad has. So it can connect to stuff without using Bluetooth or power, and it can give them power and charge them. So you can get the Magic Keyboard and power an old keyboard by the smart connector. Or even better, you can get the Magic Keyboard again. Note that I'm referencing it a lot because that's the best accessory for the iPad. You can get the Magic Keyboard and you can plug your charger on the side and you can charge your iPad, so it becomes a wireless stand. So the Magic Keyboard, it's amazing, and the 3-pin connectors or the smart connector on the iPad, it's the best thing it has. And another thing that it has, which is very powerful, is the speakers. So the iPad Pro beats the MacBook Pro this generation, the 13-inch 2016, when comparing it, the sound that comes from them, because while the iPad Pro has 4 small hole sides, the MacBook has 2 big ones. You can see here the MacBook has these huge columns with holes where the sound comes out, but when you compare them both, again, the 13-inch and the iPad Pro 2018, you notice that the 13-inch 2016 MacBook Pro has a sound a bit louder, but it's tinier, so it sounds with a lot more noise, and while the iPad, it's clearer, it's like bassier, it has a little bit more bass, so I prefer the sound from the iPad, and I think when you compare them both, you will have the same opinion. So another point for the iPad, 2-0 by now. The best thing that the MacBook Pro has for it is the port selection. I can't believe I'm saying this, because this generation of the MacBook killed all of the ports, leaving us with just USB-C, but that's true. You have 2 USB-Cs, Thunderbolt 3, and you have an headphone jack. So you can get a lot of I/O with that. You just get a little hub and you get USB-A a HDMI port, Ethernet port, another USB-C Thunderbolt 3 port with just one USB-C Thunderbolt 3, while the iPad has only one USB-C. That's not Thunderbolt 3. So that's my first request for Apple, that in 2021, this year's iPad that's coming in April, so in a couple of weeks, this is what leakers are saying. They're saying that the iPad Pro could get a second port, but they're not sure and it's not being talked about much. So in my opinion, it's not coming. But I'm saying that Apple should release one with two Thunderbolt 4 ports or two USB ports 4, so it's the same of Thunderbolt 3, because it's life-saving when you have two ports, one for charging and one where you could connect a hub. Or even better, get two Thunderbolt 3 ports on the iPad, and when you connect to the Magic Keyboard, you have another one to charge. So you would have three Thunderbolt 3 ports, where you could use two for input, so a camera and a microphone, or a camera and an external display, and you can charge your iPad using the Magic Keyboard port, which is not Thunderbolt 3. So two ports on the iPad would be amazing, but there are not a lot of leaks talking about that, so I would not expect that on the next 2021 iPad Pro. The display on these two are pretty much similar right now. They have almost the same brightness levels, where the iPad has a liquid retina display and the MacBook Pro has an LCD one. They're pretty much the same. They are color accurate, and I think they are HDR capable too. While the iPad Pro has a 2K display, the MacBook 2 has one. So they're pretty balanced in this category. So I can't say that the iPad Pro has a better display in terms of quality, and when compared to the MacBook Pro. One thing that I can say is that the iPad Pro has an 120Hz display, which makes things silky smooth, while the MacBook only has a 60Hz display. But the MacBook has a little bit bigger display with a 13.4-inch display, while the iPad Pro only has a 12.9-inch display. But since they are very balanced each other, I'm giving a point to the iPad Pro because of the 120Hz display. Again, on the iPad Pro 2021, leakers are expecting a mini LED display, so it will beat the MacBook. So Apple is doing one of the things that they need to do to bring me over to the iPad Pro, which is improve the display. Another thing that's pretty easy to compare with these two, it's performance. While the iPad Pro is expected to have an A14X, which is pretty much the same as the M1 without the Thunderbolt controllers, the MacBook Pro 14-inch is expected to have the new M1X, which will be even more powerful than the A14X and M1 that iPad Pro architecture will be based on. So in 2021, I believe that the iPad Pro, it will be powerful than the MacBook Pro until the 14-inch MacBook Pro arrives. So when that one drops, you can't expect the iPad Pro to beat that. That's a laptop. The other one, it's an iPad, but it will have an amazing performance. So you can't compare them both and say, wow, that's weak, wow, that's very, very, very fast. You just will say, wow, that's fast, wow, that's even faster. So when compare them both, a point to the MacBook Pro 14-inch because it has a better chip, assumably. But in 2021, I don't think that people will choose one or another because of the performance. The average consumer, if they need a computer, I think they will balance for the iPad Pro if this one has almost the same performance as the MacBook Pro 14-inch. The pros, otherwise, they will need as much performance as they want to. So the MacBook Pro, it's their only choice. While the software on these two, it's very different. One has iPadOS, which is based on iOS. The other one has macOS, which is the oldest of the OSs from the Cupertino company. But if you compare them both, they are very, very different. You have to prefer one to another. So I believe that if you are an older person, you will prefer the macOS because you are used to it, you grow up with it. But if you are a younger generation that grew up with touchscreens and iPads, you would prefer iPadOS. It's more intuitive and clean. The macOS is built for point and arrow, while the iPadOS was built for touch input. While Apple has created iPadOS with touch input in mind, they've added cursor support. So if you prefer using the cursor, you can use it on the iPad, and it's even revamped so you can improve your experience on a touch-based OS. So right now, These two OSs are very different, you have to choose which one you like the best. But in my opinion, there's something that Apple needs to do if they want the iPad to win the software war when compared to the MacBook Pro 14-inch. They need to give it Pro app support. So last year, in 2020, Apple added 2 GB of RAM to every iPad. So every iPad Pro now has 6 GB of RAM, while the MacBooks, they go 16, 32, or even 64 GB of RAM, which is a lot when compared to the iPad. So in this regard, you can see why Apple hasn't added Pro support for the iPad. Maybe it's because of the RAM management that these apps need to. So in 2021, I believe that Apple will add a bit more RAM to their iPads, so a minimum of 8 GB or even 12. It wouldn't surprise me if they launched the new 2021 iPad Pro in April with 12 GB of RAM, because then I'm expecting it in WWDC to get Pro app support. So Logic Pro, Final Cut Pro, Motion, all those beautiful apps that I use to grow this channel up and every creator uses too. LumaFusion is great, but it's not the Final Cut Pro replacement, so please Apple, bring Final Cut, at least Final Cut. I'm not asking that you bring Logic, because who uses Logic? Musicians? Pfft, who cares about them? Just bring Final Cut Pro to the iPad. Simple as that. Give it 10 GB of RAM, 12 GB of RAM, 36 GB of RAM, 64 GB of RAM. But please, just bring Final Cut Pro. I would pay almost anything, but not a subscription. If it is a subscription service, I will not pay for it. Just one-time purchase like $100, $150, or even $50 to compete with LumaFusion. It will kill LumaFusion if they do that, but I don't know. LumaFusion is great. I've used it to edit some videos, maybe the first 3 videos of my channel, but Final Cut, it's much, much better. I believe that if Apple wants to kill the conversation between these two devices and bring everyone over for the iPad, the best thing they could do is give the iPad the Pro app support. John Prosser has talked in the past that Apple was interested in bringing Pro app support to the iPad, and it was even working on it. So I just want Apple to make the exact same app from the MacBook to the iPad. Just port the app from the MacBook to the iPad. Do not change it one bit. Or even, if you want to change it, get it better, not worse. While macOS is an open source software, iPadOS is a closed source one, so it's much more difficult to install outside software to your iPad. While the MacBook, it's easier, you can go on Safari and install software on your computer. The iPad, it's almost impossible. You have to go through App Store. So iPad, it's more secure when compared to the MacBook. But, listen me out. When comparing it in physical security, which means Touch ID or Face ID, you will get Face ID on your iPad, which is just amazing. If you have a Magic Keyboard, you just get there and you look at it, you click on the spacebar and you are in. While the MacBook, you have to use Touch ID. There are rumors being saying that the MacBook Pro 14-inch would get Face ID this year, but it's very, very unlikely. There have been almost no leaks in the last few weeks saying that, so it was a year ago that they reported that the Face ID was coming to the MacBook Pro redesign. So do not expect it on the next MacBook Pro. When comparing it those, you would get Face ID. You see where I'm going. If you bring all categories together and you compare them both, you will see that the iPad, it's almost perfect. There are some things that you need to iron out, like ProRAW support or even better RAM and port selection. So if you get these 3 things right on the next 2021 iPad, which is amazing if they do that, I believe that Apple could kill their MacBook line for the average consumer. So listen me out. The leaks are saying you would get Pro app support and even a better display. While they are not confirming it, I believe that Apple will put at least one Thunderbolt 3 port on your next iPad. So they won't use the Thunderbolt 3 port, they will use USB-C 4, which is the same. So if Apple does these 3 things, which leaks are supposing it will do, it will kill the laptop for the average consumer and finally replace the laptop or the Mac or the PC with an iPad. So Is an iPad a computer? Let me know in the comments down below. While you're there, leave a like and subscribe. I'm very thankful for 22 subscribers, but I would like to grow it a bit better. So this was Tech Summer talking to you here. Bye.